I spent a lot of time in Africa growing up, and in Ghana they have a simple saying that always comes to mind in a situation like this. Twi speakers say this, have this proverb: one must come out of one's house to begin learning. So I think I've already learned a whole lot sitting here with you, and hopefully we'll learn some more. Senator Edwards, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to be here with this great group of progressives too.
You spent a lot of time highlighting poverty on the campaign trail. We try to do it on our show as regularly as we can, but just so we're all on the same page, paint me a brief portrait of poverty in America today.
Well, actually, I think one of the problems that we face in trying to address this issue nationally is there's a misconception about what poverty is and what the face of poverty is. You know, I think a lot of Americans, if you say the word poverty, and it's one of the reasons, by the way, I think a lot of politicians don't like to use the word, is they immediately in their head paint a picture of the guy that they, or the woman that they had to walk by homeless going to work that morning. And of course that is part of the picture of poverty, but they completely miss the vast majority of people who live in poverty, millions of whom are working, millions of whom are trying to support their families, doing everything they can do. I think they get a misconception about what poverty in America is.
It's people who often really want to work, really want to contribute. That's the misconception that the wider population sometimes misses.
Not just people that want to work, it's people who are working. I'll tell you, I told you this story earlier. We did a television interview before we came here tonight. But I've been a lot of places in America. I don't even know how many now, 150, 200 or more places where they're helping families who are struggling. And just last week I was in Newark, New Jersey, and with a table of about 20, 25 people. Got some New Jersey people here. And there were a bunch of remarkable women around the table. It was mostly women. And there was one woman at the end of the table who told me that she had been a school teacher. She already had one degree. She'd gone back to school to get a different degree. And she had 2 or 3 children, I've forgotten, single mom. She was working 2 jobs, working 50, 60 hours a week, and going to school full time at the same time. And she said, the simplest way I can describe this for you is, I never pay my electric bill or my gas bill until I get the cutoff notice, because otherwise I can't keep up. And this is a perfect example of exactly what I'm describing. Women like that and families like that are in many ways the personification of poverty in America today.
If you use the official figures, I think you come up with like 37 million Americans fall into the official definition of poverty, but statistics can obscure the American reality. You think we should cast the net more widely when trying to count people up?
Oh, it's much broader than that. I mean, that's sort of the core, and that's the starting place. But in terms of addressing these issues, when we think about the policies that we need to have, you know, whether it's unionization, raising the minimum wage, universal health care, all the things that are so desperately needed, we need to think of a much broader population than that 37 million. Now, they're central to it, but they're not all of it. There's a much bigger group than that.
Yeah, the definition, I think, officially is a family of 4 living at under $20,500 a year. Now, you know, especially mature people here in the audience may think, well, 20 grand, you could live on that. Adjust it for inflation. In 1965 dollars, it's $3,000 a year. In 1975 dollars, it's $5,000 a year, a family of 4. You start to see that definition of poverty seems lacking in that context.
Oh, it is. There's absolutely no question about it. I mean, here's the truth. People who are either meet the definition of poverty or are just above it, the millions who are just above it, it takes nothing to put them in the ditch. Nothing. I mean, they live every day on the edge of a razor. If they get, and by the way, you take a solidly middle-class family who has no health care coverage, and you know, they have a child who gets catastrophically sick, and they're straight in the same place, exactly in the same. Half the bankruptcies in America are caused by health care costs. So what I always say to them, and not to get us off the subject, but what I always say to them, I said to these women in Newark, for example, I say, here's how I want you to think about me. You know, I spent all this time in politics, running for president, vice president, et cetera, remarkably unsuccessfully. And And I said, I want you to think of me as your megaphone, because that is what I am. You know, every story you tell me, like the woman who told me this story that I just conveyed to you, you know, what I can do is if you tell me your story, I can be your voice. I can go across this country, I can get on television, I can speak to millions of Americans, and they will hear what your struggles are. And when they hear your struggles, they'll understand in a much deeper way what it is you're going through and millions like you are going through. And this is why it matters. The policy solutions, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of those tonight, the policy solutions are important. They're meaningless unless we create the political will to move them. We first have to create the grassroots political movement to get this done. So people have to understand and feel and empathize. I saw this description, I guess about a month ago, interesting description. It said one of the reasons that America has one of the weakest social welfare networks in the industrialized world is because in the industrialized world, we are the most diverse. We have a significant Latino population. We have a significant African American population. We are remarkably diverse. And what that does mentally is people think they're not like me, right? You know, they don't look like me, they don't sound like me, they don't feel like me, they're not like me. Therefore, we collectively don't need to do anything about this. Whereas if you live in Scandinavia, the odds are pretty good they're like you, right? At least superficially. So the bottom line is this. What I believe is one of the most important responsibilities of the next President of the United States, I would argue maybe the most important responsibility, is to convince the American people of a central concept. And that is that we are in this thing together. That what we do as Americans affects every other American. That what happens to every other American affects us. And then the next step, that what happens to children being born in sub-Saharan Africa, in the slums outside of Delhi, in rural China, what's happening across the planet, we are directly tied to. The fate of your family and your children is directly connected to the fate of every other family on the planet. Because when Americans get that, and it is an absolute truth, I mean, there's no question about it. It is true. And if the American people get that, then they'll understand that chest thumping and, you know, we're going to do what we want because we're rich and we're powerful doesn't work. The big problems that face America and face the world, from damage to ecosystems, climate change, population growth in the poorest places on the planet, you know, sub-Saharan Africa being a great example of that, extreme poverty, 1 billion people living on $1 or less a day, 3 billion, half the planet, living on $2 or less a day. You know, unless we deal with these problems collectively, they cannot be solved. However great a nation America is, and it is a great nation, we can't solve these problems alone. It can't be done. And the American people need to feel their connectedness to every other American and every other person on the planet.
I want to get to the politics of that in just a second, but why don't you just quickly share for these good people your ambitious goal?
Well, we're running a campaign. It's called Half in 10. The idea is to cut the poverty rate in America, this is domestic poverty, in half in 10 years.
In half?
In half. And totally achievable. We can eliminate poverty as we know it in a generation. But what's required is a comprehensive effort to do it with a set of ideas that we know empirically work. Most of them are complicated. It's raising the state minimum wages, local minimum wages, state and federal minimum wages to a real wage, a living wage. It's strengthening the right of unions to organize in the workplace. It is making child care and child care tax credits more available to more families. It's expanding unemployment insurance. These are all work-centric ideas. In other words, for those who are working, give them a chance to do better. There are a bunch of other things we need to do, but that are not central to what we're doing. But I believe that we can, particularly if we combine that with universal health care, changing our housing policy in America, being willing to put more money into affordable housing, both ownership and rental housing, making access to college simpler. I mean, we really, literally could eliminate poverty as we know it, and every American would benefit from it.
That's the key to making the point that every American would benefit from it, because the stark fact of the matter is poorer people, for complicated reasons that you probably understand better than any other audience, poorer people do not vote at the same rate as richer people. And therefore, politicians often have the impulse to ignore them.
Well, the politics are complicated because what has happened in America is courageous leaders. Bobby Kennedy, who's one of my political idols, but not just Bobby Kennedy, LBJ, others, led the war on poverty that began in the 1960s, which has been much vilified. The truth is the war on poverty cut the poverty rate in America in half in the course of about a decade. Now, that's not to suggest we didn't do anything wrong. Anytime you do something big and bold, you're going to make a few mistakes, and we made some. But we can learn from those and make changes. And because of the war on poverty, by the way, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have early childhood education, we have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We have a whole group of laws that have had huge benefits for America, for me, myself, as a matter of fact. So we did things that work, but we got to take those things and expand on. But what happened was, you remember Reagan, welfare moms, all that stuff. Basically what it did is it put fear into the hearts of politicians who no longer wanted to talk about it. They don't like to use, just listen. Listen to political leaders in America today. They don't even like to use the word. They're afraid to use the word poverty. That's the reason you have to talk. You have no idea how many times I've heard, from political consultants, you have to talk about the middle class. You can say inequality, you can't use the word poverty. Well, the hell I can't. Yeah, I can. If in fact we have people living in poverty in America, yes, I can say it. It's the truth. When you speak the truth, there's a certain power associated with that.
But there's also certain power in broadening the pitch, explaining to middle-class people who feel also, particularly right now, very insecure, that they could be part of this process. They could benefit from these changes.
And it's true. I mean, if you look at when we've had real growth in this country, real sustainable economic growth, it's not complicated. We've sort of broadened the foundation for that economic growth. We have strengthened the middle class, and we've lifted millions of people out of poverty. That's when we've had real and meaningful and sustainable economic growth. You cannot sustain, if you just picture this in your mind's eye, you cannot sustain just putting all of that growth in the top 1 or 2%, which is what we've had over the last 7 or 8 years. It doesn't work. And what we've seen over the last 8 years, although it's gone on longer than that, you can't just say it's happened in the last 7 or 8 years. What's happened is we've had real economic growth. It is empirically true, but it's almost entirely concentrated in the people at the top. And there's a lot of reasons for it. Bush and his policies have played a significant role. Globalization has played a role. But the bottom line is we have got to lift people out of poverty, strengthen and grow the middle class in order to benefit all Americans economically.
We're having this discussion at a point where a lot of headlines about just how bad the U.S. economy is right now. Many of you may have seen on our show, we had a piece out of Alabama not too long ago. They have a quite regressive taxation system in Alabama. Among other things, they put sales tax on groceries. And we had a wonderful family that we profiled that had to make weekly choices between getting a bagel and buying milk. But Callie Green was the mom's name. There's a sweet, very honest moment in our piece. Our cameras caught this, where she says, we keep reading about recession, and everybody on Wall Street upset, but my people, she says, we've been in recession all our lives. And people really feel that...
She probably doesn't think it's a mental recession.
She doesn't think it's a mental recession. She's had needs that are not being met by society for a very long time. That said, is it tougher now that the economy more widely is seen as being in such tough shape? It's harder to make the pitch. You go to a middle-class person and say, help poor people. They're like, help me. I can't, even put gas in my car.
It is harder, but that's why this case for everybody being connected is central to the concept. If what you're saying to them is, I know you're struggling, but help these people out of benevolence and the goodness of your heart, and that alone, that's a hard case to make when people can't pay their bills, they're paying over $4 for a gallon of gas, et cetera, trying to send kids to college. If, on the other hand, they believe that the long-term financial security of their family is connected to the long-term financial security of every family in America, that's a different equation.
A lot of people here specifically thinking about the idea of building a movement, and you've already alluded to it. Is that how you build a movement? You cast the net very broadly, you pick up even upper middle class people who are feeling economically insecure?
Well, I can tell you what I think. I don't know that I'm right about this, but I can tell you what I believe. I believe that first, national leadership is absolutely required. It cannot be done without it. I wish it could. It'd be great. That doesn't mean you can't do great things in communities and in certain regions, but if you actually want to have a serious national movement for this kind of change, it requires national leadership. It requires somebody or group of people that Obama, for example, could do it. It requires somebody who goes on television and American people say, I know that person, I should listen to what they have to say. Because without it, what you have are segmented efforts being engaged in by good people who really care and are deeply committed in various places around the country. But they're never going to be comprehensive, they're never going to be connected to each other without national leadership. I mean, that's why, you know, when people say, well, why haven't we done anything meaningful about poverty in America in the last 20 years? Because there has not been any sustained national leadership. Without it, it can't be done. That's why the war on poverty was a real and meaningful national effort to do something about this cause. And it's the kind of effort we need today.
Guilherme Pereira was on this stage about an hour and a half ago talking about the danger, among other things, of isolating different issues into silos and everybody sort of working on a specific issue. You're talking about a national campaign that broadens, it's so broad, it sweeps up all the issues together.
No, it is important for America to understand that these things don't work in categories. You know, there's a natural rhythm to this if you think about it. I mean, if you watch the way television operates, no, not PBS, but television, that what happens is they need to do these things in segments. It's the way they market, it's the way they present issues. So the result is, so what are you going to do about the economy, right? What are you going to do about poverty? What are you going to do about health care? What are you going to do about the war? What are you going to do about gas prices? What are you going to do about energy? What are you going to do about global warming? All in their own little baskets, right? Every one of them are completely connected to each other, entirely connected to each other. You can't separate out these things. And you also can't separate out, particularly today, what's happening in America as opposed to what's happening in the rest of the world. It doesn't work. You know, I'll give you an example. I do think we need to grow the union movement. I think we need to organize workers in America. I think we ought to be organizing workers around the world, not just in America. Because I think that what happens here affects what happens in other places in the world and vice versa. You know, I don't mean to get on a soapbox about this, but everybody in the audience knows it, but when children are starving and AIDS is being spread rampantly through Central Africa, that absolutely foments political disruption, you know, political instability. And the result is people live in an environment where they're incredibly susceptible to being recruited to extremist causes. All these things are connected to one another. And that's why we so desperately need visionary national leadership in this country who understands this connectedness, who understands that we're going to need big ideas and we're going to have the guts to stand behind them, even in difficult times, and that those ideas we have a disciplined approach to sustaining them.
Have you had occasion to talk to the candidates left standing about your poverty proposals?
Yes, I have. Well, before I got out of the race, I talked to Obama and Clinton at the time about some very specific things, which for now I'll keep private, but I got very specific commitments from them about making poverty central to their campaign, making it central to their presidency, and some very specific substantive ideas behind that. I've also spoken to McCain. It's a little harder with him.
But you've talked to McCain about these poverty issues.
I have. I know John McCain very well, served with him, traveled around the world with him, It's a little tough because I'm supporting his opponent in the presidential race and doing it vigorously. But having said that, while he doesn't agree with a lot of the policy ideas that I'm behind, he's been receptive to the concept that this is something we have to do something about.
Yeah, and the voters will decide. In the end, it could be McCain. Do you think he has a progressive bone in his body and would take you up on some of this?
I guess we'll find out in case that happens.
You said to me earlier.
I hope we don't have to resolve that question.
You said to me for television earlier, you're betting on Obama. That you think that's the way it's going?
Oh, I do. I sure do.
We'll talk more about that in a second. Regardless of who wins, I think I've already written their inaugural address. At least this is the fear of some people in this room, I would suppose. The inaugural address goes like this: My fellow Americans, I made a lot of promises earnestly in my campaign. I really meant them. But in preparation for taking the oath of office, they've showed me the secret book. And I didn't have any idea how bad the economy was. I didn't realize how truly bad the Middle East was. And the fact is, we don't have money for anything, and I'm really sorry about it. Thank you very much. You're proposing a major government program to attack a crucial issue at a time when we're in bad straits. That's going to hold you back, isn't it?
This is the difference between leaders and politicians. If what we do is stay back, look at what public opinion is, see what the public is saying at some moment in time we ought to be doing, why do we even need a president of the United States? I mean, what we need is somebody who understands where America needs to go and has the guts to take us there. And that means riding through the temporal waves in public opinion. Or, for that matter, even what's happening in the short term with the economy. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't be addressed, far from it. But I think that we have to have long-term vision about these things. We just do. And we need leadership that's willing to do it. And I think we have at least one candidate who'll do it.
We've framed this discussion around the idea of poverty, of course, but how far away is the idea of race from any discussion of poverty in America?
So it's central to it. Absolutely central to it. I don't understand. First of all, I don't know why it's so, although I think it's been healthy, the discussion of race that's occurred so far in this presidential campaign, or at least most of it. But I think that anybody who's paid any attention to American history, how can you, I mean, first of all, slavery, followed by segregation, followed by overt discrimination, followed by less overt discrimination, has an economic consequence. One of the economic consequences is black Americans have a net worth of about 10% of white Americans. This is not an accident. It didn't happen because of some inferiority of race. That's absurd. This happened because black people have been trying to catch up and have been stomped on and put down forever. You know, and finally they're getting to the place they're starting to make some progress, but they have a long way to go. It's what affirmative action's about. It's what a lot of the things that we're trying to do to create real equality in this country is about. But if you're black, you have about 10% of the net worth of white people, and Latinos are in roughly the same category. It's slightly better, but not much better. And none of that should be shocking to any of us. It's why we have to really work on this equality question.
And people start to get ahead.
And you go, if you're me, and you actually been in communities all over this country, meeting with poor people, you don't have any question that poverty has a face in America and is largely a face of color. There's absolutely no question about it.
And when people start to move ahead, they get driven back. We were hearing from Tanya Harris earlier. She works for Acorn in Louisiana.
In New Orleans?
In New Orleans.
Yep.
And shared a statistic that surprised me, and I've covered some of those issues down there, which was that many of the people in the 9th Ward and another neighborhood, Gentilly, were homeowners, 70% of the 9th Ward. And so they had bought into the American dream, were starting to move forward, yet when their houses were swept away by the natural disaster, you started hearing politicians talking about bulldozing the entire neighborhood, even though there were homeowners there.
Yeah, yeah. It's heartbreaking, actually. What's happening in New Orleans is so symptomatic of problems that exist that we haven't been willing or able to face up to. I mean, anybody, I'm sure a lot of people in this room have, but some of you will remember that I announced my presidential campaign in the 9th Ward, and I ended it in the 9th Ward. And there was a certain symmetry to that. I wish that symmetry didn't exist, but it does. And anybody who's spent any time in New Orleans knows that very little has changed since the hurricane hit. I mean, I was there just shortly after the hurricane came, and what I see when I go there today is very similar to what I saw at the time. And by the way, most of the work that's getting done there is being done by local groups, faith-based groups, community groups, charitable groups. Where's the government? I mean, really, these folks that you're describing who lost their homes, people in the 9th Ward, throughout that part of East New Orleans, I mean, the bottom line is they don't see anybody working for the government. They just don't. They have no idea what they're doing. No idea, even though there have been billions of dollars appropriated for it.
So help us monitor your progress in your fight to cut poverty in half within 10 years. Get through the presidential race, then it'll be 2009. What should we be looking for specifically that'll give us some sense about whether this is going anywhere?
There's a very clear early indicator, which is whether the President of the United States has created at least a cabinet level position responsible for dealing with poverty in America and the connection between that and the issue of extreme poverty in the world. One person at the top responsible for that. If that's been done and it's married to appropriate authority, infrastructure, and money, then that's serious. If, on the other hand, they're just mouthing words, it's the same old stuff that we've heard for decades. I mean, real action is what's going to be required, and my own view is that a cabinet level position is needed. In fact, you asked me earlier about John McCain. One of the reasons I spoke to John McCain is on April the 4th, the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. Martin III called me and said, all right, I got Obama, I got Clinton, but I don't have McCain. Will you call him? And I did. And he didn't agree to a cabinet level position, but he actually made a very strong statement about what he was willing to do. I'm still not for him.
Maybe if he proposes the cabinet level position. And so is the contrary true? If we're looking for signs this is falling apart next year, follow the money maybe?
Yeah. If you don't hear the President of the United States talking about this issue, addressing it on national television, mentioning it or speaking about it in the inaugural address, then those are clearly danger signs.
Now I was milling around here, meeting as many people as I could before we got together here, and they all want me to ask you, well, a number of people I met want me to ask you about Senator Obama and the perception that he's moving to the political center now that the general election race is on. Do you see that?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think historically it is a normal thing to have happen. I think that some of the things that Barack is being accused of are not fair and not right. Listen, there's nobody in, I ran against him, so there are obviously some things that I don't completely agree with him on. But, for example, suggesting his Iraq policy has changed is just not true. It hasn't changed. What I hear him say today is exactly the same thing I've heard him say throughout the campaign. And when he talks about meeting with military leaders on the ground, and I think that's part of what this trip that's going on now is about, that's something any responsible president of the United States would do. There's nothing unusual about that. There are some areas, where, for example, I am violently opposed to the telecom companies getting immunity for violating the law. I think in his defense, he believed. I don't think he supported that either. I think his position was there was a lot of other things in the bill that we needed badly, and because we needed those, he was willing to live with that.
All right, but what about the thumbs up for the Supreme Court decision on the D.C. handgun ban?
Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let him speak for himself. My view is a lot easier for people like me and us to sit around and criticize somebody who's clearly a progressive. And anybody who thinks he's not a progressive is not paying attention. This guy is clearly a progressive, and he spent his life fighting for these causes, and I think he's committed to them.
I missed an opportunity earlier when you're talking about what might be termed the anti-poverty czar or the fairness czar. You want that job?
I'm not looking for a job.
You don't need new income to make ends meet?
What I want to do...
I warned you this one would be more freewheeling than that last one.
I'm going to ignore that.
Okay.
What I want to do is I want to give voice to people who need a voice in this country. That's what my life is about. If that's in government, that's great. If it's not in government, that's fine. Whatever place it finds itself is perfectly fine with me. I mean, I look at what people like, what Al Gore has done on climate change, and he's done a remarkable job outside of government. You don't have to be in government to change things. But that doesn't mean government's certainly a possibility too.
Senator Obama has been extraordinarily good at raising a lot of money, but in smaller contributions, not having to just go to the same old big money sources that have had such an overbearing role, I think, in our democracy heretofore. There's an argument that that leads to more progressive policy, maybe even more radical policy once he gets into office. He's not beholden to the folks who've had such a strong say. What do you think? Will it translate his fundraising technique into more sweeping positive change?
I think it's very healthy. I think it gives him, give anybody, but it gives him a freedom that otherwise would not exist. It's one of the reasons I've always been a strong supporter. I think we ought to publicly finance every campaign in America. But that aside, what it means in the context of this particular campaign is he is much less beholden than previous presidential candidates have been to big dollar donors, which means he can, if he's willing to lead on it, and I believe he is, create real transformational change, which is what America desperately needs. Little things, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Little things will not address the challenges this country's faced with. They will not. Little mini steps and baby steps and, being careful and cautious will not do it. And we need bold and strong, powerful ideas that the president's willing to stand behind. That's what we need. And we need 60 seats in the Senate.
How's it going in the House and Senate? What's your view on that?
The one thing that I am absolutely convinced of is that we will pick up significant number of seats in the House, we being the Democrats. We'll pick up significant number of seats in the Senate. The question there is, do we get to 60? A lot of things would have to fall into place for that to happen, but I think we got a great chance. So I feel very optimistic about both those.
I heard you when you said that issues should not be taken on piecemeal, that there's power in building a movement around looking at this broadly. That said, the new president will come in, and the conventional wisdom is they'll have 1, 2, maybe 3 big domestic or international policy issues that they can focus on. And it'll be a big fight over that. Is it going to be climate change, energy policy? Is it going to be the economy? Is it going to be the war in Iraq and Afghanistan? Do you think you're going to get poverty in there?
Yeah, I do. And I think I'll get it in there, number one, because I think Obama will be elected. Number two, I've already gotten I trust him, and I've gotten a personal commitment from him on this subject. I don't think it's the only thing. The president's got responsibility to do a lot of things, but it's pretty obvious what the big issues are. I mean, the war, the economy, energy, health care. I mean, it's very hard to get anybody to disagree with those being the major issues facing the country.
Do you ever wonder, this is a perverse question, but I've often heard people mull this over, do you think a Democrat really wants to inherit what they're going to inherit if they become president?
No, that's a good question. That's a good question. Yes, because as much as I love the Democratic Party and as much as I love our candidate for the Democratic Party for president, those things pale in comparison to the needs of the country and the world. And what ultimately matters is we've got to move America. We need to quit worrying about political consequences and move America, and America desperately needs to be moved in the right direction. And we have to win the election to do that.
Well, Senator Edwards, they wanted us to go till 7:30, went to 7:34. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. I really appreciate it.